Brazil's former president, Jair Bolsonaro, has returned home after spending 3 months in the US state of Florida. Hundreds of his supporters were on hand at Brasilia's airport for his arrival. It's the first time the far-right politician has set foot on Brazilian soil since supporters stormed the Supreme Court, Congress, and presidential palace in January. The riots came after weeks of protests claiming fraud in his defeat to President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in October's election. He's facing a number of legal challenges, including an investigation on whether he incited the rioters. Well, Arise correspondent Laurie Laird has been monitoring developments from London, and she joins me live now. Good to see you, Laurie. Of course, he only touched down in Brazil just a few hours ago, but what kind of reception is he getting on his return? Any idea what greeted him on his arrival?
Well, I understand, Charles, there were certainly some supporters at the airport, but there are also some reports from Brazilian media that there were more riot police on the ground at the airport than there were supporters. So perhaps not quite the homecoming that he was hoping for. That said, he left the airport through a side exit, so the supporters really didn't get much of a glimpse of their hero. We understand he went straight to the headquarters of his Liberal Party. He spoke to party members. He spoke to some ex-ministers. Exactly what he said is not entirely clear, but we have heard from party leaders and also from Bolsonaro's son himself that while Bolsonaro doesn't wish to lead the opposition in any sort of a formal way, that he wants to play a part in politics as somebody who has had experience. And I think the feeling is that he will become a lot more active in municipal elections that are due to take place next year.
Well, that's what I was keen to actually ask you about. I mean, whether we know what kind of attitude he's going to take to politics now that he's back, or is he as inscrutable as ever when it comes to what's going on inside his head?
I mean, certainly, we haven't heard much from the man himself. We're hearing things from his allies and his son. The rhetoric doesn't seem to be quite as belligerent as perhaps we might have expected. We've heard nothing about stolen elections. We know that Bolsonaro has not accepted the result of the election in October, but we haven't heard much from his supporters about fighting the last election. It's more talk about fighting these municipal elections and what may come next. In fact, some of Bolsonaro's supporters have said that President Lula da Silva won't make his term, that somehow he will be impeached. And that has been a fate that has felled a number of Brazilian presidents in the past. So it almost feels like the Liberal Party is looking for a way to depose da Silva during the course of his term and reinstall their hero. Now, one thing that will get in the way, as you mentioned, Charles, is these many lawsuits that are pending against Bolsonaro, including one that has to do with he's accused of embezzlement with something to do with the receipt of jewels he says were from Saudi benefactors. He'll have to give evidence on that as early as next week. So that sort of thing could certainly slow his political reestablishment.
And I think you touched on this briefly, but now that he's back, Laurie, I mean, is there any chance of healing the divisions that have cleaved Brazil in half? I mean, or is that not on the agenda?
It certainly doesn't feel like Bolsonaro is returning to unite people. And if we ask about his timing, I mean, that has been the big question. When might he leave Florida? When may he return to Brazil? And the feeling is that perhaps he sees that President Lula da Silva may have got himself into a bit of a situation here. Lula da Silva never had a particularly strong legislative agenda. We didn't hear very much about it during his days on the campaign trail. Legislatively, Lula has not accomplished a great deal. He's rebranded a couple of social programs, but he hasn't really got much through Congress. Now, to be fair, a lot of that has to do with inertia in Congress. The Brazilian Congress is made up of representatives from so many different parties. It can be very difficult to get legislation through. So it may be that Bolsonaro sees a weak spot for the president and thinks this is the time for me to make my return.
And is there a sense, Laurie, that politics in Brazil might have sort of moved on and other politicians on the far right have now emerged? And I mean, even in his party, I mean, there are governors and members of Congress who've got their own agendas.
Certainly, and a lot of analysts are saying that perhaps Bolsonaro's time as the figurehead of the far right may be over. But the one candidate to keep an eye on, Charles, I think, is Michelle Bolsonaro. You'll recognize that name. That is Bolsonaro's wife, and they trotted her out during the campaign. She did a couple of stump speeches, things on the family, things on Christianity. These are always, sort of strong spots for Bolsonaro. He likes those hot button cultural issues. And it may be that she is being groomed to take over leadership of the Liberal Party. And we say Liberal Party, that's the name of the party, but certainly this party is right of center. And the feeling is that perhaps Mrs. Bolsonaro is being groomed to take over should Jair Bolsonaro get caught or be barred from running because of these legal questions against him.
Well, we're going to be keeping a very close eye on those court cases, lawsuits that he's facing. Laurie, thank you very much indeed, Laurie.